The Elder Scrolls lore goes deep, very deep, as I'm sure you all know by now. I'm not even necessarily talking about the really complicated stuff like the 36 Sermons of Vivek and whatnot. We have very in-depth information about the cultures, peoples, religions, traditions, and geographies of all the provinces of Tamriel. But, in a world with so many details, it's inevitable for a few things to slip between the cracks, or to escape some people's attention. Throughout the games, whether it be in the form of books or dialogue, we can hear word of many fascinating locales and places spread across the planet of Nirn that we never actually get to see, and that I'm willing to bet you've never even heard of. And no, I'm not just talking about places like Akavir or Atmora or Pyandania. I'm not even talking about some of the lesser known islands like Esrania and Kathnaqueya and all that. In this video, I will be presenting to you some of the most obscure and interesting places in the Elder Scrolls. The book series King Edward is the longest that can be found throughout all of the Elder Scrolls games and is exclusive to Daggerfall. It documents the story of the titular King Edward and his adventures across Tamriel that ultimately prepare him to become the King of Daggerfall. Believe it or not, Akatosh is a prominent character that appears within the story. He was said to be the leader of a village in High Rock where both humans and dragons resided together. Now, King Edward is known to be in-universe fiction, so this supposed dragon village almost certainly doesn't exist, but I just love the idea of it so much. The book, The Art of War Magic, written by Zurin Arctis, is a parody of the real book, The Art of War by Sun Tzu. One of the lessons written within the book contains the following. Master Arctis advised Tiber Septim before the Battle of Five Bridges not to commit his reserves until the enemy was victorious. Tiber Septim said, "If the enemy is already victorious, what use is committing the reserve?" To which Master Arctis replied, "Only in victory will the enemy be vulnerable to defeat." Tiber Septim went on to rout an enemy army twice the size of his. We're obviously focused on the location here, being Five Bridges. This was supposedly the site of a big battle that we never hear about again. What kind of place has 5 bridges? This battle likely took place during Tiber Septim's conquest of Tamriel during the Tiber Wars, which means that this could literally be anywhere. Scourge is a Daedric artifact attributed to the Daedric prince Malakath, being an ebony mace that has the power to summon and banish Daedra. Its very first appearance was in Battlespire, and alongside it could be found a book called The Legendary Scourge, which states that it was used by a warrior called Macan that fought against Mehrunes Dagon's servants. It also states that it was forged from sacred ebony in a place known as the Fountains of Fickledire. Its description in the book, Tamrielic Lore, that appears in Morrowind describes it as being forged in the fires of Fickledire. What is Fickledire? My best guess is that it might be some kind of region within the Ashpit, which is Malakath's plane of Oblivion. The talk of fountains and fires makes me imagine lava, so maybe some kind of volcano? Yes, you saw that right. Sheogorath mentions this offhandedly in a dialogue you can have with him in ESO, during a quest where you're sent to the Circus of Cheerful Slaughter in the Shivering Isles.
Don't be presumptuous, mortal, or I'll banish you to the Isle of Lusty Bards!
This is the only ever mention of it. Maybe it's just some kind of joke, but if it's real, I wouldn't mind being banished there, you know? Included in copies of The Elder Scrolls II, Daggerfall, was a small booklet known as the Daggerfall User's Guide, which gives some general game info. Included within the manual is a section titled History, which essentially gives a much more detailed version of the game's introduction in text form. It describes the player character's past and relationship to the Emperor, Uriel VII, gives more context for the events that take place right before the game starts, and describes the player character's journey from the Imperial City to the Iliac Bay. It is explained that the player character reaches the Dellese River and the Iliac Bay through a body of water called the Yrinthi River, which was presumably accessible from the Imperial City, or at the very least, Cyrodiil. The text mentions that the Dellese River, the Iliac Bay, and the Yrinthi River were all infested with pirates, which implies that it was likely a commonly used and wide waterway. But the Yrinthi River is never mentioned or seen in any future titles. Seeing as it was only ever mentioned in this booklet that who knows how many people actually read, I think it's pretty safe to assume that this detail was simply forgotten about down the line. 3 separate book series, Pala, A Dance in Fire, and 2920, The Last Year of the First Era, all make mention of a settlement in Cyrodiil called Mir Corrup. It's described as a well-known and prominent resort for nobles, and was famous for its hot springs. It's mentioned that it's supposed to be somewhere in Nibene, but we never actually see this place in Oblivion or ESO, which I think is a little disappointing personally. Taking a hot springs bath at the end of a long day of adventuring would have been pretty nice if you ask me. The word wall used to obtain the third part of the Fire Breath shout in Skyrim can be translated to say the following. Here fell Herfoder, Sunslayer, mighty warlord of the Valley of Broken Dreams. There's no other information given as to what the Valley of Broken Dreams actually is, or was, but it sounds really cool, no? Volume 2 of Scary Tales of the Deep Folk from ESO describes a tale told by Markor, a scout from the Reach in Skyrim. According to his story, Reach folk would typically stay far away from old Dwemer ruins, but Markor and his childhood best friend, Isana, resolved to explore an old ruin named Darkhollow. While delving through its depths, Isana claimed that she could hear some kind of music coming from beneath the mountain, which Markor was unable to hear at all. Isana became obsessed with the music, and would hum it constantly, even in her sleep. Isana would travel to Darkhollow every day, even after the clan Witchmother had forbade them from going there any further. One day, Isana left for Darkhollow one last time. Markor followed after her, venturing to the farthest depths of the ruin, but found no traces of her, save for an animal skin that had the words, "I found it," scrawled across. It's uncertain if this story, or even Darkhollow itself, is real, but it's an interesting read nonetheless. I talked about this briefly in a short I made a long time ago, so if you want more details you can go and watch that, but I'll bring it up here again really quickly. The first edition of the Pocket Guide to the Empire mentions an Imperial College of the Voice in Markarth, which was supposedly established by Tiber Septim in the early years of the Third Era, dedicated to returning the way of the voice to the ancient and honorable art of war. We never see this in Markarth in Skyrim though, which is quite a shame, but at least we have the Greybeards. The first edition of the Pocket Guide to the Empire mentions a couple of more obscure locations. 2 of them are Balhar and the desert oasis of Nohotogrha, which are said to be in Hammerfell. The Pocket Guide claims that fanatical devotees of the serpent god Sadakal were infamous for the strange rituals that they performed across the Alakir desert of Hammerfell. When they weren't gathering together and terrorizing the countryside, they were known to imitate snakes by stripping bare and rolling in the dirt, biting at those who would pass by and even, quote-unquote, shedding their skin in gruesome displays. They were also known to slither across the desert for 100-mile stretches, all the way from Balhar to the oasis of Nohotogrha. You might also remember Nohotogrha being mentioned in Skyrim by Galathil the Face Sculptor, who can be found in the Ragged Flagon in Riften.
I have not always been a ragged beggar. I learned my art from the masters of the art of flesh sculpture. I studied with the faculty of chirurgeons and Cloudrest. I walked with the hollow-faced men of Nohotogrha for 3 years. I count the nobility of both the Empire and the Dominion among my clients. And yet, I have fallen so low that I must justify myself to a wanderer in the sewers of this backwater of the world.
I have no clue what they're doing down in Nohotogrha, and honestly, I don't think I want to know. Let's move on. The High Rock section of the first edition claims that a group of islands known as the Dellese Isles are part of its territory. Bringing up the topic of High Rock during a conversation in Morrowind lets us see the following. High Rock encompasses the many lands and clans of Greater Brittany, the Dellese Isles, the Dellese River tribes, and, by tradition, the Western Reach. The rugged highland strongholds and isolated valley settlements have encouraged the fierce independence of the various local Breton clans, and this contentious tribal nature has never been completely integrated into a provincial or imperial identity. Nonetheless, their language, bardic traditions, and heroic legends are a unifying common legacy. So it sounds like these Dellese Isles should be a pretty prominent and well-known part of High Rock, no? The thing is, these are the only mentions of this group of islands we ever hear of. These islands don't ever appear on any official maps or anything like that. I just think it's kind of strange that this was implied to be some kind of prominent location, but it's almost like it doesn't even exist. It's featured somewhat prominently in the story The Republic of Hod by Michael Kirkbride, but it's an unofficial out-of-game text, so maybe take it with a grain of salt there. The book, Notes for Redguard History, is found only in Daggerfall, and was written by Destry Malarg, the same author that wrote the book, Redguards, Their History and Their Heroes. Notes for Redguard History is an unmailed letter to his publisher in the Imperial City, talking about his next planned chapter for his series on Redguard history, regarding Derek Hallen and his battle against goblins invading Hammerfell in the early First Era. Malarg includes these lines in his letter. At the time of this story, Hammerfell is fully occupied by Redguards. All the old cities of the dwarves, but one, the ghost city of Dwarfhome, are now the cities of today's modern Hammerfell. A second invasion of the giant goblins comes. Hammerfell is unprepared, except for a few faithful followers, all youths in the rural halls of virtue. The ghost city of Dwarfhome? That sounds pretty interesting, along with the implication that the old cities of the Dwemer make up the modern cities of Hammerfell, perhaps like Markarth in Skyrim. But there's something else of notable interest in this book, which I would honestly say is one of the weirdest bits of Elder Scrolls lore I have ever come across. Going back a bit to the story Malarg was describing in this book, the whole thing with Derek Hallen and the goblins, let me give some more context. Back when Hammerfell was first being explored by settlers from Yokura, more specifically, the first Ragada wave led by Frendar Hunding, they found that Hammerfell was occupied by giant goblins. They waged a huge war, and Frendar Hunding ultimately fell in battle. His son, Devad Hunding, now stood in his father's place. With a group of sword singers, he created 5 magical swords that were used to defeat the goblins once and for all. This is the traditional story seen in modern Elder Scrolls lore, and what is mentioned in ESO. But what they leave out are some details from the story told in this book, the one regarding Derek Hallen. This book elaborates more on the origins of these giant goblins. It claims that they came from some kind of tear in time and space, creating a goblin gate that hordes of them would pour out through. The goblins somehow reopened this gate after it was closed by Devad several generations ago. Derek was an Onse that went on a quest to reclaim the 5 swords that had been lost, and use them to forever seal the goblins in the void that lies between Tamriel and their realm, at the cost of the swords being lost for good. Yeah, so according to this book, there's some kind of goblin dimension? Is this some kind of plane of Oblivion? A place in Aetherius? How did they cause some kind of rift in space-time, not just once, but several times over? Could this be the actual origin of goblins? As cool as that sounds, I think this is another relic of old lore that should probably just be considered a myth in-universe. Any future mention of the giant goblins leaves out this extra-dimensional aspect of it. There is a shrine dedicated to Derek in ESO that mentions his recovery of the swords and his final defeat of the goblins, as well as a flashback scene involving the war, but this goblin dimension is never discussed or brought up. The swords are still mentioned to be lost, but it's somewhat implied that they were destroyed in battle, or something along those lines. Michael Kirkbride has stated that back around the time of Redguard and Morrowind's development, there were originally plans to have the origin of the orcs tie into this goblin dimension, with these giant goblins being some kind of prototype for the orcs. But the idea was never utilized, and the concept of a goblin dimension was just ignored going forward. This makes the origin of the giant goblins vague, and it's somewhat up in the air if the concept of this goblin dimension can still be considered canon. The whole idea of other dimensions and planes of Oblivion existed, but wasn't entirely fleshed out during the time of Daggerfall, so it's uncertain how this would really fit into modern lore. Crafting Motif 71, Cold Snap Style, found in ESO, was written by Landal Gavant, who was a scholar of goblins at the Invisible College of Daggerfall. Now, an Invisible College is an actual term, used to describe groups of researchers or thinkers that collaborate informally rather than through official institutions. But come on, this is the Elder Scrolls. In my mind, this is a straight-up invisible college. Ancient Tales of the Dwemer, Part 2, The Seed, by Mirabar Sul, mentions a Dwemer village called Lorik that was supposedly located in the grey and tan dunes and boulders of a region known as Dejasyte. The thing about the Ancient Tales of the Dwemer series is that they pretty much have no actual historical basis. The publisher's note from Volume 1 states that Mirabar Sul was likely a pseudonym for the playwright Gorfellam, who essentially just took a bunch of folk tales he heard from across Tamriel, changed a bunch of names, and said that they were, as the title says, Ancient Tales of the Dwemer. So it's not that surprising when the publisher's note in the second volume says that Lorik clearly isn't a Dwemer name, and it doesn't exist. But he doesn't directly deny the existence of this region called Dejasyte. For a bit more information, we can look at the French version of this book, which has a slightly different publisher's note. There, it's written that Lorik could be any Dwemer ruin in the desert called Dejasyte, between Morrowind, the Black Marsh, and elsewhere. Now, this is quite interesting because it implies that the region between Morrowind, Black Marsh, and elsewhere, which would be southeastern Cyrodiil, is covered in some kind of desert. But obviously, we never actually see or hear of this anywhere else. I don't really know how this is supposed to fit in lore-wise. You could argue that because of the inherently made-up nature of the Ancient Tales of the Dwemer that this region might not even exist. But again, the publisher's notes don't deny its existence. You could also just say to ignore the French version and place Dejasyte anywhere else. In 1999, an early Elder Scrolls fan site known as the Hall of Adventurers conducted an interview with Michael Kirkbride and Ken Rolston, while Morrowind was in early development. They would answer questions while role-playing as characters from across Tamriel. The interview mentions a Steamgate quarter in Vivec, as well as a Dwemer antiquities shop in Pelagiad, both of which are never seen in-game. I really wonder what the idea for the Steamgate quarter was, but I guess we'll never know. Vounoura is mentioned across a few in-game books, an island that's said to be a month's journey off the coast of Tel Arun and Vardenfell, a place where Morag Tong agents are sent for retirement or if they become too well-known or sought out. What do Morag Tong agents do in their retirement? Beats me, but it sounds like a fun time. How does one generally travel to the Plains of Oblivion? You obviously might think of the Oblivion Gate seen in the Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion, or some portals encountered throughout ESO, but how does one get there in the absence of special circumstances? This is explored in the book, The Doors of Oblivion, which goes over the mage Morian Zennis and his journeys through the Plains of Oblivion, as told by his apprentice, Saif Ij Hijja. Oblivion was the key subject of Zennis' research, and he searched for many years to find a way to travel there. The following text describes his efforts in detail. The doors to Oblivion, to use Morian Zennis' phrase, are not easily found, and we exhausted many possibilities before we found one where we held the key. The Psijics of Artaeum have a place they call the Dreaming Cave, where it is said one can enter into the Daedric realms and return. Iakasis, Sothasil, Nematig, and many others have been recorded as using this means, but despite many entreaties to the Order, we were denied its use. Solaris, the leader of the Order, has told us it has been sealed off for the safety of all. We had hopes of using the ruins of the Battle Spire to access Oblivion. The Were Gate still stands, though the old proving grounds of the Imperial Battle Mages itself was shattered some years ago in Yegar Tharn's time. Sadly, after an exhaustive search through the detritus, we had to conclude that when it was destroyed, all access to the realms beyond, the Soul Cairn, the Shade Perilous, and the Havoc Wellhead had been broken. It was probably for the good, but it frustrated our goal. The reader may have heard of other doors, and he may be assured we attempted to find them all. Some are pure legend, or at any rate, not traceable based on the information left behind. There are references in lore to Maruk's Abyss, the Corrington Mirror, the Mantellan Crux, the Crossroads, the Mouth, a riddle of an alchemical formula called Jacinth and Rising Sun, and many other places and objects that are said to be doors, but we could not find these. Some exist, but cannot be entered safely. The whirlpool in the Abyssean called the Maelstrom of Baal can make ships disappear, and may be a portal into Oblivion, but the trauma of riding its waters would surely slay any who tried. Likewise, we did not consider it worth the risk to leap from the Pillar of Thros, a 1,000-foot tall spiral of coral, though we witnessed the sacrifices the Sload made there. Some victims were killed by the fall, but some, indeed, seemed to vanish before being dashed on the rocks. Since the Sload did not seem certain why some were taken and some died, we did not favor the odds of the plunge. They later discovered a means through knowledge shared by Devaith Fear, which Hidja keeps vague out of fear that the knowledge is dangerous for the average person to know. But it is fascinating to hear about all these potential avenues into Oblivion. The Dreaming Cave does appear in ESO, the Mantellan Crux is prominently featured in Daggerfall, and the whole section on Battlespire is obviously explored in the game of the same name, but there are no other mentions of places like Maruk's Abyss, Crossroads, Corrington Mirror, the Pillar of Thros, and so on. And with that, we come to the end of this video. There are many other obscure locations mentioned throughout Elder Scrolls lore, but a lot of it essentially boils down to a town name being brought up in passing, with nothing else of real significance being mentioned. I figured that wouldn't be very interesting, so I only brought up the ones that I thought had any actual substance to them. If you are interested in seeing a much broader list of obscure locations, UESP has a very exhaustive list that I pulled a lot of this information from, that I will link down below. And who knows, maybe when Elder Scrolls 6 finally rolls around, we'll get more information on some of these places, and maybe hear about a couple of new ones. But until that happens, whenever that is, I'll see you all next time.